Le premier de nos orateurs est un économiste respecté, c'est Peter Bossaerts, qui a été longtemps à Caltech, qui est aujourd'hui aussi à l'École polytechnique fédérale de Lausanne. Et Peter s'est engagé dans l'économie expérimentale depuis à peu près 10 ans, si je comprends bien. His title was First Theory of Mind in Games and Markets. It has been changed into decision-making under uncertainty, emotion, intuition, and mathematics. So that's a broad subject. Peter, it's up to you. You have 40 minutes.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Well, first, it's an honor to be here and to be able to present some of my work and work of my collaborators. As Roger said, the title has changed a little bit because Colin and I, we actually coordinated our talks to make sure that you don't see the same thing twice. I'm going to talk about decision-making under uncertainty, and it's good for the purpose of this talk to distinguish two types of uncertainty. One is uncertainty generated by an unintentional source, like nature. Supposedly nature is unintentional unless you're of the more religious type. So we're talking about playing gambles against a random number generator and things like that. Or, as you'll see later, financial markets without insiders. You don't have to fear these markets. There is a price and you can buy at it. The price does not necessarily reveal any information. As opposed to that, there is uncertainty generated by an intentional source, and the immediate example that comes to mind is strategic uncertainty. You're playing a game with somebody else, and you don't know what this person is going to do for perhaps two reasons. One is this is a game with a mixed strategy equilibrium, or another reason is there could be multiple equilibria. In my talk, I'm going to talk only about mixed strategy, mixed strategies of the opponent. Colin is going to expand on this. Another example that's actually less obvious is financial markets with insiders. That is, you're playing in this competitive market, but you know there are agents out there that know better than you do, or everybody has a piece of information, and that information gets aggregated in the price. You have to be careful then. When you trade, because you can run into a winner's curse. Right? So that's the picture to start with. There are two types of uncertainty, intentional and unintentional. My next slide will basically tell you what I'm going to try to get across to you. I think I'm going to try to, with 4 examples, to get 5 messages across. One is, it is possible to describe the functionality of emotional brain areas in terms of mathematics. What I'm going to do is actually, I'll give you an example where we look into anterior insula, which is very much associated with emotional reactions, even empathy. And I'll show you that you can actually understand the functionality of that part of the brain also by using mathematics. The same thing is going to be true with intuition. So I'll talk about theory of mind, mentalizing, and show you that actually parts of the brain that are engaged in mentalizing, like paracingulate cortex, are doing specific mathematical calculations. So that gives a little bit a better idea of what theory of mind is about. These are insights, that's a third message. These are insights that come from parametric modeling of functional imaging data. So most of what you see today is not simple contrast between black and white, two situations, but really parametric modeling, attempts to modeling the signal that you see in fMRI or EEG or whatever means you use to look at the brain. The fourth message is then kind of obvious, you can understand, and I think this is reflecting a little bit the discussion this morning before in the introductory session, namely that the economics provided the parametric models for this, as you'll see. Even if some of them are incorrect, they give you a very good benchmark as to how to think about signals that or encoding that's happening in the human brain. And then finally, and this will probably be the most controversial statement I'm going to make, especially with respect, because of a statement that Stanislas Dehaene made this morning about reverse correlations in the brain. I'm going to try to give you an example of how understanding functionality of brain signals allows us to see what people think, and not to say this is what really is going on, but to start shedding light on important economic puzzles, to narrow down the possible hypothesis that could be at play in a situation where basically after 40 years of research we have no idea what is going on, why people are making the choices, and how come they have certain skills or they do not have certain skills. Right? So these are going to be the 5 messages I'm going to try to get across. The first one is, I'm going to do that through 4 examples, as I mentioned before. And the first example is anterior insula. As I mentioned before, this is structure. Brain structure is heavily involved in emotions, disgust, empathy, pain. It's also very crucial in the somatic marker hypothesis of Antoine Béchara and Antonio Damasio. But recent evidence from around 2003, 2004 has shown that this brain structure has signals that seem to be tracking risk. Defined in a very mathematical way, a way that a decision theorist would do. And more specifically, and this is what I'm going to show you today, is a risk prediction error. This morning, Tim actually talked about reward prediction errors and how these reward prediction errors come about through a reinforcement learning mechanism. The learning rate, as he correctly pointed out, has to be modulated depending on a number of aspects of the environment, and one of them is prediction uncertainty. So how precise your predictions can possibly be, which is the volatility or the uncertainty. That of course requires the brain to be learning about risk as well. And one day, Kerstin Proishov, my former student, and Steve Quartz and I, we sat down and tried to actually locate in the brain a risk prediction error, very much in analogy with the reward prediction error that you see in the dopaminergic regions of the brain. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is not the original paper. I'd rather actually go to a very recent paper that was just accepted for neuroimaging and show you what is going on there, because in fact that paper was based on a very popular experiment out there, namely the Iowa gambling task. Let me just say a little bit about the mathematics. So the traditional reward prediction error is the reward minus the expected reward. This is I use the same notation, at least for the reward prediction error that Tim used this morning. So it's the delta, and it's the reward you get minus what you expected. So the V or the nu hat is your expected reward. What is risk? One way to define risk is the expectation of the size of the reward prediction error. Is the size of this going to be small or large? And you can measure size in a number of ways. One is you take just a square. And let's call that H as hat HT. So this is basically what you expect the typical prediction error to be. And I think the French statement for this, écart type, is really captures the essence of it. It's your typical mistake you're going to make. Now, when you of course you're going to make a mistake, and what you're going to do is going to compare that mistake that you made, the actual mistake, which is the size of the delta, with your prediction, right? And that's your risk prediction error, CT. For a reason that we don't understand yet very well, actually the brain signal, or at least the way you see it in the fMRI, seems to be correlated more with the square root of this, or the sine square root of this. That's basically a scaling issue, right? But the way you have to think about this is basically the outcome, the actual size minus the expected size. So let's see how this works in the Iowa gambling task. I presume that you're all familiar with this. This is a task that the Damasio-Béchara group developed to understand decision-making by brain lesion patients, especially ventromedial prefrontal cortex and amygdala patients. Basically, you have 4 decks of cards, and you can pick from these decks. And if you pick a card, then basically you're going to get some gain and maybe some loss. So red is all the accumulated losses, and green is the gains. And of course, you're only interested in the net gain. So you want the green bar to be as far as possible to the right, and the red bar to be as low as possible to as far to the left as possible. You have no idea what is behind these cards, or what's on each deck. You basically have to learn that. This is, for the mathematicians among you, a very difficult four-armed bandit problem. Unlike the classical mathematical versions of this, you have no clue. You're not even given the information that the variance, for instance, is equal. Basically you start playing this gamble, and so here is time, and here is 0. I just took that out of the paper as a snapshot. This was one of the outcomes in their experiment, where a subject actually was picking from the decks, and the black line is the actual payoff, and you see, the person got small payoffs, and the other one's a big loss. That's basically when red started jumping enormously. If you look then at the reward prediction error, you can clearly see initially this person thought that actually that the payoffs were going to be very, very low, and after receiving some positive payoffs, he's really surprised. So he gets some positive prediction errors. And then, of course, when this big negative prediction error arrives, so by that time this person had high expectations about the next payoff, there's a big drop, as you can see, a big negative prediction error. The risk prediction error is basically the size of this of the reward prediction minus what you expected it to be, and as you can see, it often correlates positively with the reward prediction error, but not necessarily. Here, for instance, when the big loss comes, the risk prediction error is big because evidence has accumulated over time that actually these decks are not very risky, and then all at once you get a big loss. You say, "Oh, wait a minute! I got my prediction, the size of the prediction error wrong." Right. So what we're going to do is actually we're going to the brain with these signals and try to identify where they are located. Now, for some we already know this, like for instance, payoff. We also know it for reward prediction error. You will, in imaging data, you will see this in striatal areas, ventral striatum in particular. Also caudate, because this is an instrumental task. But where is the reward, the risk prediction error? So that's basically the size here. And so that's, as I mentioned, in this paper by Decremont, and Van der Linden and Bechara, in this forthcoming Neuro-image. And what they did is actually they modeled learning based on a simple Karl-Wagner learning rule for both risk and reward. Right? In fact, the reward learning rate is modulated by risk, very much like in a paper that I published with Kerstin Preusshoff. And in fact, I shouldn't go much in depth with this because it's very similar to what Tim was explaining this morning. And here is the main result. There's a number of results. I focus on the more important thing for this talk, which is what happens in insula. What you have here are the t values of the correlation of the brain signal in this anatomical region, the insula, with the three prediction, the three aspects of the reward process. Namely, one is the payoff. The second one is the reward prediction error, and the third one, the big one, is the risk prediction error. As you can see, the t-statistic is 6, which means there's brain, the activation in anterior insula is very highly correlated with this mathematical concept called risk prediction error. Basically tell you that brain structure that we associate so often with emotional reactions is very much also involved in encoding something that's very mathematical, which doesn't mean that actually this is orthogonal to the emotions, but this may be actually part of the emotional process in calculating or in doing optimal learning. Incidentally, I didn't put that here because I didn't know exactly what Tim was going to talk about, but you see the same signal in anterior cingulate cortex, the region that he referred to this morning, which is why I asked him the question of whether it was risk learning versus modulating the learning rate that you would see in anterior cingulate cortex. So that's the first example, anterior insula, an emotional part of the brain, which is just mathematics. and we're able with parametric modeling to come at a little bit a better understanding of what that brain structure does, and hopefully one day also be able to say a little bit more about what emotions do in our decision making, right? Which is something that we are very much interested in. Second brain structure is paracingulate cortex. So the frontal part of the prefrontal cortex, which we know is activated in mentalizing tasks, in theory of mind tasks. And one example, since Gallagher and Fritz and McCabe's papers, show that actually this is involved also in playing a strategic game with an opponent. And what distinguishes the games that actually they looked at is that they have mixed strategy equilibria. So there is strategic uncertainty. You don't know what the opponent is going to do. So now it really matters to think about what the intentions are of your opponent. These two studies are based on a simple contrast between playing against a human opponent and playing against a computer, not just any computer, but a computer that the subjects knew was using a program which was a very simple adjustment rule to the outcomes that came out of the game. And that contrast showed, among others, paracingulate cortex, but also superior temporal sulcus as being very much activated. What we were interested in is understanding what does it mean formally. What are the computations that are going on in, for instance, paracingulate cortex? Right? We looked actually at both superior temporal sulcus and paracingulate cortex, but today I'm going to talk about just paracingulate cortex. Because we want to understand we want to better understand what mentalizing is about, right? And here again, economics comes in. Actually, very recent economics. And it has to do with learning in games. So if you look at game theory and attempts of both the theorist and the experimentalist to understand how people learn to play a game, a repeated game against the same opponent, we distinguish actually four theories. One is simple reinforcement learning. And the way I have to interpret it here is you choose an action with the highest experience payoff. So I tried to go left all the time, and that seemed to be working. I have basically no need for strategic insight. I just try whatever works. Fictitious play is a little bit more sophisticated. That is, you try to best respond. You're already a game theorist. You try to best respond to the past pattern of the actions of the opponent. Now you follow the opponent. You try to track what the guy is doing, and you see that most of the time he goes up, which makes you go left as a result. You'll see that in the game in a second. And then you can have some mixture of reinforcement learning and fictitious play that seems to be going on. Actually, what people are doing, experience with it, attraction learning, which Colin worked on with Tech Ho. And then we have something actually that has escaped most of the attention of the game theorists, which Colin calls teaching, which we called influence. I don't particularly agree that this is a good term for this, but let me explain what it is. So when you do a fictitious play, right, you try to best respond to the patterns of your opponent's play, right? But you should, when you're playing, you should take into account that your opponent is learning as well. So you're learning about a moving target, right? So in fictitious play, you do as your target doesn't move, but in fact your target does move. That person also learns from you, for your actions. So the opponent learns as well, and what you do is going to take that into account when predicting the opponent's choices. So what you know is you're going to take an action. So let's say I'm going to go left, and you know that when you go left, the opponent is going to change his or her beliefs in a particular way, and you take that into account when you're actually going to best respond next time, right? And what you found is the signal in paracingulate cortex, or in the theory of mind regions, is exactly related to the latter, and it is very much a prediction, a reward prediction error. That is, you look at what your reward would have been if you hadn't done this. You look at what the expected reward is based on this, and you look at the actual reward based on the play that you're going to undertake. And so to give you an idea how we found out about this, so we take a very simple worker-shirker game. So there is an employer against whom you play. You're the employee. The employer can inspect you or not inspect you. You can work or shirk, and if you look at the payoff matrix, of course, we set it up in such a way that the employee prefers not to work, and the employer prefers not to inspect. Right? This, with this particular payoff matrix, this game has a mixed strategy equilibrium. You can do, our subjects played this against a human opponent, an actual human opponent, in several trials in a row. And so you're trying to figure out what the employer is really thinking about you. You're trying to do fictitious play, and you're trying also, at least some subjects, to understand the influence that their actions have on the beliefs of the opponent in order to better predict what the opponent is going to do next, and then best respond to that. And it's the latter that actually we see in the paracingulate cortex. So here's the main picture for at least paracingulate cortex, so you can see the location. This is basically identical to what you see in Gallagher and Fritz's paper, or what in McCabe's paper. The only thing is that this signal now is obtained parametrically. That is, we looked in the human brain to find the reward prediction error for this influence aspect. Right? So what's the effect of my actions on my rewards in the future? And am I making mistakes there? And the mistakes, the real prediction errors, are encoded there. What's also interesting is that this signal is correlating with the intensity with which the subjects were involved in doing this influence learning, I should say. If you look at their behavior, you can fit the model with influence learning to their behavior, to their choices, and then see on the right-hand side who is more involved in this, trying to predict how the opponent is going to change his or her strategy as a result of your own actions, and what effect that has on your rewards. And here you have the the more strategically unsophisticated people who just do fictitious play. Right, so they think they're playing against a computer that doesn't change the algorithm at all, and you just try to best respond. You try to figure out what that computer is doing, and then you try to best respond to that. And if you look at the signal strength here, how much the correlation is between the influence signal in the theory and the signal in the brain in fMRI, you can clearly see this positive correlation. I think Stanislas also talked about it this morning. We have to be careful with interpreting imaging data. I should just say that actually the x-axis was not used to determine this activation here, right? So they're basically orthogonal exercises, so it was nice to see some nice correlation here. All right? So what does that mean? We seem to, we start to unfold or to discover exactly what it means to be mentalizing, to do theory of mind. And I think Colin actually will explore this a little bit more, because there's a lot more going on at this. What we also found is actually this is related to basically higher order thinking, hierarchical Bayesian thinking. And you see activation in those brain regions as well in such task. Here is the third example, medial prefrontal cortex. Ilke said a lot about this this morning. If you look at the earlier papers in neuroeconomics, I should say, it looks like that the activation in that system was more interpreted as a system 1 activation. For instance, in McClure's paper on the decision-making over time, whether you're actually going to go for impulsively for today's for an immediate reward, or you're willing to wait 2 weeks or 1 month, you see activation in medial prefrontal cortex, ventral striatum, and a number of other things, preferably when actually today's option, an option to consume immediately, is available. However, others since then, including Hilke, have shown that in fact that encodes value. So let's look at it much more closely. So we have, when I mentioned system 1, I was really referring to the dual system theory, which in Evans' terminology, in his survey paper, recent survey paper, he would refer to as a situation in which two neural systems coexist and provide valuations and compete to drive decisions. So what's important is, of course, the coexistence, the valuations, but we now, after listening to Hilke's talk, we know a little bit, first, where to look for in the brain, and second, how to interpret what that means, and competition. Now, to really test this dual system theory, we thought we needed actually a task where first choice could be computed in two ways. So you have one option, let's say the bar of chocolate that we saw this morning, and there were two ways to evaluate the value of this chocolate bar. Chocolate bar is kind of hard to say, certainly it's Belgian chocolate, it can only be good. But I'll give you an example where you can actually compute the choice in two ways. The two valuations have to be imperfectly correlated throughout the entire experiment, and that's actually not very obvious to find situations where that is the case. And more importantly, subjects show about an equal tendency to follow the advice of either valuation. That's misspelled. To follow the advice of either evaluation. A lot of system theory examples in the neuroscience literature have situations where you have a number of subjects who tend to be more using system 2, and another subject follow system 1, and then it becomes basically an inter-subject analysis. No, we want to see that within a subject. Let me just go to the task and then show you what we found. So this is a task with 3 doors. And in every trial, there is a present behind one of the 3 doors. The probability that the present is behind the first versus the second versus the third door is fixed, but non-equal. Right? So it could be that most of the time the present is behind the second door. Then we ask the subject not to indicate a door where the present should be, but actually to rank the doors. So what is your first choice? Here it's the middle door for the subject. What's your second one? It's the right door. What's the third one? It's the left door. And then, there is some blank screen, and then we give them some feedback. The present was actually behind your choice number 2. Now, here's how we rewarded subjects. If the present was behind choice number 2, like here, they didn't win and they didn't lose anything. If the present was behind their first choice here, then they won $1. If the present was behind their third choice, their worst ranked door, then they lost $1. Right? Now you have to basically figure out how to rank. One way to do that is just try and see. This is basically a very primitive version of reinforcement learning. I try this. For instance, I try 3, 1, 2. If after a while I see it doesn't work, I'll try something else, like 2, 1, 3. Another way is to actually do it fully optimal with a Bayesian approach, in which you actually have to follow the probabilities of payoffs in each of these doors and then try to find the maximum probability and the minimum probability door. The value of the game then is basically the difference between these two probabilities, the maximum and the minimum probability door. So now both systems generate a value signal. If you just try and see, the value signal will take on a certain number, and the Bayesian will actually also have a value signal. It turns out in this game, given the subject's choices, these value signals have positive correlation, but not too high. It's about 0.4. So that was a way for us to actually start studying this issue of dual systems. And to also, what was striking in this task as well was if you look at how much the subjects were Bayesians versus how much they were reinforcement learners. So what we did is we fit a Bayesian model to their choices, and then we fit a reinforcement learning model to their choices. You can see that basically everybody is on close to the 45-degree line, right? Which means that subjects seem to be, if you look at their choices, equally likely to be a reinforcement learner as a Bayesian learner. Normally, if you in other types of tasks, what you normally see is some subjects are clearly more Bayesian than others. Some subjects are clearly more reinforcement learners than others. But here we have a task where people seem to be kind of doing both at the same time. And that's how we found then 2 value signals. After having listened to Hilke's talk, you should expect this to see value signals in the medial prefrontal cortex, and indeed that's what we see. The system 1 value signal is here, the medial prefrontal cortex, just right in the middle. The Bayesian signal is there is more ventral and then also more rostral towards actually the paracingulate cortex, which is not the first time I see this in Bayesian tasks, where actually the paracingulate cortex is involved as well. You see also prediction errors. You have prediction errors from, actually, no, I don't have that slide. You also can see in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, since I was focusing on that one, you see a signal that predicts whether the subject is going to follow system 1 or system 2. So system 1, you see this very, very nice signal. You see also signals in globus pallidus and anterior cingulate cortex. But let me focus on the medial prefrontal cortex. So you don't only have value signals, but also signals that actually predict whether the subject is going to choose according to the Bayesian versus the reinforcement learning valuation. That is, whether system 1 or system 2 predicts better the choice that the subject is going to make in the future, which in this particular case meant in the next 5 seconds. Right? So we have 2 value signals, giving some suggestion that actually there are indeed dual valuations being generated in the human brain. My final example is about reverse correlation, and this is about thinking about trading in markets with insiders. Don't think anything bad about insiders. This is not the Airbus or the Eats guys who do illegal things by buying stock or selling stock in their case before the public knew that actually the Airbus 380 production was in trouble. No, these are basically other people who are better informed about what the payoffs are going to be. It's a classical type of experiment that economists have run, including Kahn, in the 80s. And why do people run this experiment? Because we don't have a good foundation for what finance people call the efficient markets hypothesis. What does that mean for the non-finance people here? It just basically means that prices somehow should reveal or reflect the information that's out there. So, for instance, when there's a lot of inflation out there, the fact that the government announces in the past there was inflation should have no effect on the prices, because everybody who feels the information, the inflation in the daily life, trades on the basis of the information, and hence the price aggregates all this information. Right? That is, to get efficient markets hypothesis in theory, in an equilibrium model in finance, you need something that's called a rational expectations equilibrium. But it has come under a lot of criticism because, in fact, that equilibrium notion requires structural knowledge of the economy that subjects and agents in the economy basically don't have. You have to know everything about the economy. You have to know all the supplies of all the securities, all the preferences, all the production, everything like that, so that you can figure out basically how they can read information from the prices. With the knowledge they do have, they won't get very far, and I should refer here to Guénary's work on this, where he actually shows in a constructive way what should you give them in order to at least have some chance to have something like a rational expectations equilibrium. And this is where we started. Experiments have shown invariably that even novices quickly learn to read information from prices correctly, as if they have rational expectations, right? And thus making market prices efficient. And this is a real puzzle. It's one of these things that, you set up an experiment and you bring in these undergraduate students that my colleagues in finance think they're all stupid, right? And you make them trade, and lo and behold, the price fully reveals all the information out there, which basically, according to theory, requires that each of these subjects knew the structure of the economy. And we didn't give them the structure of the economy. We didn't even tell them how many people there were in the market, what their assets were that they were holding, what their risk preferences and so were. So we were thinking, since we actually take these stupid, quote unquote, undergraduates, we thought we may be engaging a very fundamental human trait here. So what we wanted to do is actually just look in the brain and see what people were thinking while they were exposed to such markets. So as we did, we set up an experiment where we replayed the order flow from a prior experiment where there were insiders or where there were no insiders. So we took a very, very nice contrast. So the markets are either insiders or not. The security paid 25 cents on average, a maximum of 50 cents, a minimum of 0. And so we have the two conditions, as I mentioned, insiders and no insiders. Now, what they were seeing was this movie here, which is a graphical representation of what we call in finance an open book, the trading mechanism, the activity in a market. This is basically, in a graphical display, what's going on every day on Euronext, here in Paris, for instance, on the stock exchange. which is bids to sell. These are the red bids, and then the prices are right in the middle of the circle, and bids to buy, and these are the blue bids, and the prices are in the circles as well. Once in a while, some of these bids turn green, which means a trade takes place. Right? And subjects were looking at this while they actually were exposed to the risk. So they were holding a certain number of, for instance, this security here, and they were just seeing what was happening in the market to their stock. Right? And then we compared basically two situations. One is where the markets had insiders against the situation where there were no insiders. It was the same flow that you saw there, and we contrasted the two, and here's what you get. From this contrast, there are only three regions that remain, which is paracingulate cortex here. You see amygdala, and you see middle to posterior insula, something you saw this morning in Hilke's experiments as well. There's something interesting to say about the amygdala here, because that was quite surprising. We found this, but also we see paracingulate cortex. So that brought in. This is the activation, actually, I should say. This is the contrast of insiders against no insiders, but it's the signal that's modulated, again, parametrically, by how far the transaction price was from 25 cents. And remember, 25 cents was basically the unconditional payoff. So if you see the price move away from 25, it must be that there is actually some insider information being revealed in the price. When there were insiders, when there are no insiders, that is not consequential to you. You don't really have to think about this. So we see this, and you saw before in my talk paracingulate cortex. Of course, immediately to mind leaps this idea, maybe that's mentalizing. So is this theory of mind? But of course, there are alternative hypotheses. This is what Stanislas said this morning. You have to be very careful with reverse correlation. It could be, very, very different situation. So what we did is we went back and tried the following behavioral study to get to determine whether actually there is some idea of mentalizing going on here, that this is the skill that people engage. So what we do is we actually run a financial market prediction task now, a separate task, where insiders are present and the subjects have to predict stock price changes. I must say I was perplexed how well our subjects were able to do that when they were insiders. Again, that confirmed this idea that people seem to be, seem to be engaging them in a task that humans naturally seem to be very good at. Then we, actually I said hide tasks, we give them two theory of mind tasks. One is very similar to the market prediction task, so we have a graphical display. It was the Hyder movie. And then we give them also, for the fun of it, I think Colin will talk about this as well in games, we give them a math and logic task. In fact, the test that they use in, I shouldn't say Wall Street, but you're in Paris, right? So what they use for the traders here to determine whether they're going to be good traders or not. And there's basically a bunch of math and logic questions. We always pay for performance, and what we find that there is a strong positive correlation between how good they are, this is the scale, the performance scale, in one of the theory of mind tasks, and here's their trading performance. And whereas there is no correlation between how good they are in trading and how good they are in math. There is no negative correlation, but there is none, no positive either. Math and logic. So confirming this idea that maybe actually what's going on is mentalizing. We're not done yet. We need to really, get a little bit further. We know that theory of mind, or one of the conjectures out there, is that this, has to do with pattern recognition. Well, that's a mathematical task. You have to ask yourself, what are these patterns in markets with insiders that they look at? And we really don't know. You would think that after 40 years of finance research, we would be able to distinguish, at least mathematically, between a market with and without insiders, and we didn't. So we sat down and went back to our experiments and tried to figure out what distinguishes these two markets. And we found indeed a pattern that people could rely on to get at insiders. This is called in the trading literature and the financial econometrics literature GARCH. Basically what it is volatility clustering. Right? So the size of price changes are very, very persistent when they're insiders. They're not when there are no insiders. Right? Here's the evidence. I don't have time to go into detail. I just want to summarize here what these four examples tell you. So first, it's possible to describe the functionality of emotional brain areas in terms of mathematics. See the anterior insula. We're trying to do that with amygdala now, which is a much tougher task. Intuition is also math. You can see that the mentalizing in the paracingulate cortex, and when you have to play a game with mixed strategy, you can pinpoint exactly what is going on there in paracingulate cortex. These are insights from parametric modeling of functional imaging data, as opposed to these simple contrasts, as you saw in the dual systems approach. The early papers, like McClure's, looked at simple contrast. Later papers, like including Hilke's, do parametric analysis, and then you find much clearer evidence of what is going on. Economics provided the parametric models. You see that in the teaching and influence model of learning in games that Kahn actually worked on and Dahl worked on. So there were basically two economists or two groups. And then finally, understanding the functionality of brain signals allows us to see what people think and hence to start shedding light on important economic puzzles. And I see this work on thinking about trading and the implications for the efficient market hypothesis. It was a long-standing puzzle, and it cuts at the foundation of modern asset pricing theory in finance. Thank you.
Talk. I have some personal comments, but before some questions. I'm sorry. Before I ask who wants to raise question, Jean-Pierre Changeux.
Vous pouvez demander des questions en français si.
Oui, merci pour votre présentation qui est extrêmement détaillée et précise. Je suis un petit peu perturbé par, disons, votre méthode d'approche, parce que vous nous donnez un certain nombre de tâches et vous nous donnez un certain nombre de localisations dans le cerveau, comme si ces localisations étaient indépendantes les unes des autres, comme si on était en fait dans le contexte de la phrénologie et des facultés telles qu'on le concevait au XIXe siècle. Et évidemment, c'est pas comme ça que le cerveau fonctionne, puisque tous ces divers territoires que vous avez mentionnés, le cortex parasingulaire, le préfrontal, l'insula, etc., sont tous en fait reliés les uns aux autres et contribuent à, disons, un fonctionnement cérébral différencié et global en même temps. Donc, est-ce que vous avez essayé de mettre ensemble ces divers résultats que vous obtenez sur le plan de l'imagerie cérébrale avec une théorie, disons, je ne veux pas faire une théorie générale de la neuroéconomie, c'est pas ça, et du fonctionnement cérébral, mais au moins essayer de voir dans un certain nombre de cas si vous arrivez à cibler une tâche particulière avec, je dirais, la population de territoire que vous avez juste mentionné.
Est-ce que tu peux répondre en anglais? Ça va?
Comme vous voulez.
Okay. So my four examples actually focused on particular regions, as you said, and as you quite rightly said, you cannot really look at them in isolation. We are very much interested in brain circuitry. In fact, in one of these papers, we exactly did that in the mentalizing paper in the games, to try to understand what the signals in, let's say, striatal areas affect them, the signals in medial prefrontal cortex and in paracingulate cortex. So no, we are very sensitive to that. That's absolutely true. As to the second part of your question, as to whether we're going to be able to come up with a theory of neuroeconomics, that is, of course, very, very early, but I think we can be optimistic because at least we start understanding much better what the emotional parts of the brain are doing, and I'm going to use economics language. We will get a better understanding as to where we have to put emotions in our theoretical models. Where are they already subsumed by the mathematics, and where are they missing, right? And that's basically, ultimately, hopefully in 5 years, we'll be able to come up with very good models to address that, thanks to the imaging results we have here.
The learning process in a game, in a very famous game, the confidence game, some authors observe that we start by just observe the author, and after expected, and we shift at a certain time from expected value to observed value to expected value. Do you Can you explain such type of system, extend it in your view? One, that is my first question. Second question is about events to systems. Is it correlated to another view that for risk there is, as you have written yourself, different parameters? One is the expected value, the other one is the variance. And you mentioned that, in fact, the two systems are different and closely related in the final evaluation. There is a relationship between this view and the two system events, and in what sense?
Okay, I think for the answer to the first question, I should defer to Colin, if Colin is going to talk about this paper with Megan Abbat, because that is, they analyze very carefully what happens over time as you're playing a game, from what happens out of equilibrium when you're not playing the equilibrium yet, to the point actually you basically have established your expectations and you play equilibrium, right? So I will defer to Colin for that. Second thing is, so your second question about dual systems, does it have anything to do with what we find in the brain, that actually when you give people a task of uncertainty, involving uncertainty, you see activation that seems to be going in the direction that valuation is done using a mean variance trade-off approach, and other activation that seems to be expected utility, where basically people look at states, assign probabilities to them, and then look at utility in each of these of the outcomes, irrespective of the states, and then add everything or multiply everything together. You refer to the work that I have with Mathieu Dacremont about this. That is not imaging work on it, and it's just like most of the literature on dual systems is behavioral, and the behavior results seem to indicate that there is a dual system approach in the brain. But I would be very careful with interpreting it like that, because there are alternative ways to interpret from a neurobiological basis the same behavioral findings. In particular, a biasing signal that parts of the brain give to a normal operating decision system. I think inferior frontal gyrus, for instance, is a standard candidate for that. And this may be true also in the mean variance versus the state, the expected utility approach. So we do not know, and I will only be able to tell you if after we have analyzed the imaging data that we did for our task.
Just maybe I intervene here after that.
Yeah.
So, first of all, we talk during the lunch about rationality and so on. But what you call the influence learning is not so hugely far away from the rationality idea, because you try to find your best response, given that the best response of the other can change, and that's your kind of mental process. So that's the first point. I don't know whether you agree or disagree. The second point, in the type of work I have been interested, I don't fully agree with the fact that we prove that they cannot go too far in the process. It's true as inductive stability, so stability of expectation, is true as far as inductive stability has to be global. You start from nothing. It's not true as soon as inductive stability has to be local, in the sense that you are asking how stable is the expectational coordination process, and then you can come back to the type of in your experiments, it may also be the case that the local inductive stability is sufficient to trigger convergence after a while. For example, I want to say, and the general message is not that when you take the local viewpoint, the general message is that the plausibility of coordination in the set of rational expectation depends on some parameters. We try to identify the parameter it depends on. For example, on the efficient market hypothesis, a student of mine, Gabriel Desgrange, has shown in a standard Grossman-Stiglitz model that local stability is ensured as soon as the market does not transmit too much information, so that the people can trust more the information on the market. So I'm not sure, I don't understand enough your example, but My guess is that your example falls in what Gabriel found as stable, and that the result of the experiment may not contradict this rather abstract view of the problem.
To react to the first comment, I think Colin will talk about rationalizability and belief hierarchies. Correct, Colin? So he will be able to give a much better response to that question. The second is, in fact, in our experiments, what I didn't tell, there's a lot of detail in that. The noise in the system, I mean, from a noisy rational expectations point of view, went from very, very high to very, very low. The activation you see was not dependent on that. The ability for the market to get to the noisy rational expectation equilibrium did depend on that, confirming your theoretical work. Yes, there is. We actually now have the data to get to issues like the ones that you have theoretically addressed, or Gabriel Lagrange has looked at, right? Yes.
Thank you. Stanislas a renoncé à sa question pour le bien-être collectif. Donc, je ne sais pas si c'est un comportement altruiste ou de glow. Thank you very much, Peter. Yes. So the next speaker